So this is Dr. Emily Bretl. Emily was a classmate of mine at Northern Colorado the last half a decade. And she has taught everywhere, all over the world. One of the things, I don't know if she'll remember this story, but I think it illustrates what really impresses me about her. A few years ago, I was leading a student class in Rocky Mountain National Park. And long story short, I was like last minute needing a sponsor. And she was living in Denver at the time. And so to volunteer to just last minute go on a trip with high school kids was super cool. But on that trip, we were hiking back from this lake in a big glacial cirque. So it's this really big valley that was carved out by a glacier, just like this super dramatic scene. It's somewhere I've been a bunch of times. And we're on the way back, and this is, I don't know, it's at like 10,000 feet of elevation up in the mountains. And we like stop for a drink break. And she goes, "Look at that tree." And like, what, like, how do you mean like that tree? Like there's a forest here. And it's just like this one random like twisted tree way up on a cliff that I had been past dozens of times, never noticed, like never even thought of. And all the time she does stuff like that where you'll walk past something all the time. She's like, "Check out that flower." And you're like, I would have never, I probably would have trampled it without noticing. Which I think comes across really cool in how she comes across really interesting in how she approaches teaching. And that's one of the things I really like about having her here, is that it's such a different perspective and view of things from how I see the world. I think it's super useful because there's a lot of value in both. And so I'll let her go ahead and start sharing.
Awesome, yeah.
And if Morgan, are you going to share your lunch?
Yeah, right, Morgan? But I'm hungry.
Dog really wants me to share the lunch.
Cool, and I'm going to not share my lunch, but I'm going to share my screen. So let me get that up if it works. I always like when it works the first time. There we go. Cool. Can everybody see that? Just nod if so that we know that it's up. Okay, awesome. And if I know some people will be watching this later, so thanks to everybody who is able to show up and who's watching this as a recording. This will be a short and sweet introduction to arts integration in science education. And thank you so much, Matt, for that introduction. I forgot about that, and now I can totally picture that tree. I'll actually talk a little bit of my own philosophy of education very briefly in this as we start moving through it. So the aim of today is, like I said, just to introduce you to the idea of arts integration in science, particularly through examples and practical application. So we only have a short bit of time, so the examples will be quite quick and brief, but hopefully provide some insight into how you can maybe already recognize how you do this in your own teaching, or start thinking about ways that you might incorporate arts-based integration into science education. So we'll do an introduction, some warm-up, some definitions of what arts integration is, and then practice. For two of you, or either, and I guess I should call you Dr. Clay, because, you know, it is formal, but if there's any questions throughout, feel free to just jump in and kind of shout them out so we can answer those. So thanks again for having me here. You can say my name, Dr. Bretl, as in Hansel and Gretel. A lot of my students just call me either Miss B or Dr. B, so that's fine as well. My philosophy of education is really grounded. There's a truck, if that is distracting. Hope you can't hear it. So my philosophy of education is really grounded in these two ideas, so that there is beauty all around and everything is interesting. And this is something that even as a science teacher, I try to infuse into all of my teaching. So I've been teaching science in some form for about 15 years. So I started as an outdoor educator, an environmental education curriculum designer, and then moved into more formal science teaching. I also believe that teaching is artistry. And so for those of you who are just starting your journey as teachers, reminding yourselves that, yeah, there is the really tough logistical side of, you know, writing your lesson plans and aligning them with state curricula and moving through data and figuring out what needs to be addressed next. But there's also very much this part of your practice that is about moving and responding with grace and intellect and using your intuition as a professional teacher who is also an artist of some sort. You might not believe that, that's okay. That is my philosophy of education, but it's how I shape and form everything that I do. So we're gonna actually start this because I really don't know how to teach just talking. So we're gonna do a quick warm-up, an arts integrated warm-up. And now this is something that I've actually done. I've integrated it into my classes of all sorts many times. With younger students, it's particularly to help them start honing their skills of observation, description, careful listening, which, as you know, working with kids is something that they always need practice with. As adults, we need practice with. And so this is a really fun, at least my students tell me it's fun way to practice these skills without saying, we're doing science now. So the whole objective of the game is to create a drawing that matches the unseen object using clear description and careful listening. At no point can the describer say what the object is or what it does. So the whole idea, this actually comes out of traditional ecological knowledge and the idea that when we give something a particular name, it sort of changes how we see it. So by not naming something, by focusing on its characteristics and features, we're really able to look more closely at it and kind of keep a more open eye. All right, so hopefully you have a paper and pencil in front of you. I see Morgan's jumped off the bed to go collecting. So I'll give her a moment to return. Yay, she's back. All right. So typically you want to have your students, I would do this in pairs with students, but in this case, I'll be the describer and you will all be the listener / drawer. But typically you might pair them up. So one student is describing and one is listening. I often have them sit back to back. Okay, so we'll begin. All right, so the object that I am holding is really round. So on your paper, I want you to draw kind of like an oval shape that's about 2 inches long at the longest. So it should be a little bit narrower than 2 inches and about 2 inches long. And then at one of the ends, and it should be like the narrower and not the fatter part. So at one of the ends, instead of it being a curved line, make it into kind of a little bit of a point. And it's almost like a point, but if you sort of made it smudge down the point a little bit. And then on the other side of this oval, so directly across from that little point, I want you to make like a tiny little circle. And then all over it, so inside of this oval shape, you can put a whole bunch of dots all over. And they're little dots, like probably about the size of your pencil tip, maybe a little bit bigger. Okay, and then, and it's okay since we're kind of doing this quickly. And then going back to that pointed tip at the one end, coming about 3/4 of an inch away from that. So kind of down towards the little circle I had you draw. Go ahead and put a line that runs like horizontally across. And it's a small line. I should have said that in the beginning. It's only about like maybe the width of your fingernail at the most. Okay, so I'm gonna stop there. This could go on and on and on. Usually I give about 5 minutes for each partner to describe. So before I have the reveal, does anybody have a guess on what I might have in my hand? Judging by what you've drawn.
My guess was an egg.
Ooh, what made you say that?
That it had like a rounded point at the top.
Okay. Perfect. Did anybody else have a guess? You're allowed to participate, Dr. Clay.
A lemon that you should have thrown away a long time ago from my drawing.
All right. Well, I can see where both those came from. Typically, I would take more, but it was actually a little lime.
That
So
was close.
yeah, so a lemon, you're right. A lemon would have been much bigger if it had like shriveled over time. It has some scratches on it. I don't know if you can see, that was the little scratch. And so this is, again, just a fun thing. I've had students actually do completely abstract things. So grabbing like a random rock that they just have to describe very carefully. It could be something a lot more specific. Maybe you really want them to do some like detailed observation of flowers and the parts of flowers, but without actually naming it. So this is, again, it's just a fun kind of arts integrated warm-up where you're using drawing skills, where you're using descriptive language to get students to be looking and thinking in a different way. Now that plays into teaching science, right? Because those are important skills that every scientist needs to have, to be able to make accurate recordings, to be able to listen carefully to the other scientists that they're working with, to be able to take close observations to help guide them along. So hopefully that's fun. You can build off of that, maybe incorporate it into a lesson. It's also just a really fun sort of game to play with kids on a, like it's another version of 20 questions in a way. Let me see if I can actually get these out of the way. There we go. So moving forward, in terms of arts-based teaching and learning, it can be nice to have just some ground definitions to work with. So artistry and creativity are both determinedly really hard to define. If you get into the scholarly work around it, people will be like, there's so many ways to interpret this. But I've particularly drawn on the work of artistry in education and creativity as it pertains to its applications in science in particular. So artistry is really looking at using your skills, knowledge, and personality to carry out a task or respond to a situation with grace, intellect, intuition, imagination, and flexibility. Hopefully with those, that definition, you can see why I say that teaching is an art, that all teachers are artists, and that there is artistry in teaching. Creativity, on the other hand, is very similar to artistry, but also has this aspect of creating something new. So it's using those skills and knowledge and personality to do something differently, to make something novel and useful, or it could just be to discover something new for yourself. And it's really defined by complexity. So when you're thinking about, okay, how can I bring in the arts and creativity into science, don't find yourself, try not to get stuck in just thinking, oh, I have to, paint, or I have to draw. It can be a lot of different things. It could be building, it could be making. So there's a lot of ways that you can really move into this. Oops. Give me a second. There we go. Cool. So this is the formal definition if you want to get into what is arts integration. So it's an approach to teaching in which students construct and demonstrate understanding through an art form. Students engage in a creative process, right? So they're creating something new for them, which connects an art form and another subject and meets evolving objectives in both. And what I think is really important about this here is to recognize that it's not just doing art, right? It's easy to get carried away in kind of the what I usually call like the bling or the shininess of the arts part of it, but that arts integration really still is deeply connected to the content knowledge that you're trying to help your students really develop or practice. So that's, to me, that's an important part of arts integration, because otherwise what you're doing really is art teaching if you're just focusing on the art part of it. So why try arts integration? You know, if you're here or you're listening to this recording and you're saying, oh, well, this sounds fun, I'm gonna do it anyways, then that's great. But if you are more, I'm gonna pick on Dr. Clay for a minute, like if you're somebody who's more like, I am a scientist through and through, and I'm not really sure why we should be doing art in science, and I'm sorry if I'm putting words in your mouth, but, but I think that it's important to recognize that there has actually been a lot of studies around arts integration, and it has been shown that it is inclusive, right? So if you're looking to create a more inclusive and classroom that allows for differentiated instruction, arts integration can really help bring in students who might otherwise not be interested in science. It can really help to bring in students who perhaps English is their second language. Maybe it's a student who has different abilities when it comes to verbal communication. So it can be much more inclusive at times than just kind of your typical textbook and worksheets and lab write-ups. It also has been shown to improve student engagement, excuse me, to increase their self-confidence. You know, think about how if you're not a science person and you're always being asked to communicate in scientific language, how exclusive that can be and what that might do to your self-confidence. But if you are an arts person and you're given an outlet to expose that, or you're somebody who really never had the opportunity to look at science through a more artistic lens, all of a sudden you might feel like, oh, I've got something to add here. It can help us to improve our cultural understanding. It can help us to improve those communication skills because it's another way of communicating. It can help to improve cognition and executive function. So giving students different ways of making decisions, of planning, of thinking through problem solving. And then of course I put down there at the end, it raises student achievement, because that's something people always, you know, I shouldn't say always, but many people are concerned with is how does this impact student achievement in terms of be it grades or skills development. And arts integration, most of the time, because again, it's something different. So it gives another pathway for the brain to remember, to hold on, or to, you know, even be confused by, which means more questions and that extra opportunity to integrate learning. And then I also just think arts integration is really fun. So as a teacher, you can often be so overwhelmed by all the things you have to do. I find it's really important to make that space for you to do something fun that maybe takes you out of some of the boxes that it's easy to get stuck in. And arts integration, especially in the sciences, can be that way. I will send this PowerPoint out, and I've included some links that are live, and you should be able to actually read some articles if you find yourself getting excited about this. So one thing I also want to emphasize is this isn't about, when I talk about arts integration in science, I'm not saying like do it all the time, every day, in every single thing that you do. It's more about finding those small openings. So again, if you hear arts integration, you go, that sounds like exactly what I do, then awesome. Then you can keep actually looking for bigger openings. But if you're saying just the idea of teaching science sounds hard enough, I don't want to be trying to teach science through the arts at the same time, well, maybe this is an opportunity to look for a little bit of a little space where you can sort of say, maybe I'll try that, right? Maybe it's just that simple warm-up exercise that we did, describing and listening, or maybe it's something else that you find more appealing. Cool. And then I feel like as I've been doing a lot of these virtual sessions, I just like to throw in there kind of, we're all learning how to do digital teaching and virtual teaching, or even in person if you're still doing in-person teaching, which it sounds like in your area, some schools still are. But you really have to take the time to plan ahead in these virtual spaces, especially if you are going to be using different materials or having students go and do something and return. So you got to plan ahead, be patient, be creative, and then of course stay safe. So whether that's in person or if it's through virtual learning, to make sure that you're planning for your safety and your student safety is really paramount in this crazy time right now. Cool. So before I keep going, are there any questions? We're going to dive into one more. I think we'll have time for like one more real practical application. And then I'll be also offering lots of examples. But I'm going to stop talking for a minute to see if there's any questions just yet. Morgan's like, no, go. All right. Cool. So I'm one of those people who likes to like come up with ways to sort of wrap my mind and remember. Like I like making little checklists for myself. I like creating acronyms. And I do a lot of teaching around project-based and place-based ecological education, which are often things that are new for teachers. So I've created a few frameworks to help teachers start integrating new practices into the work that they do, particularly around arts integration and place-based ed, which I think we'll get to talk about next week. But in terms of arts integration, I like to think about the idea of same. So I used to live in India, and when you travel in India, there's this saying where, you know, you might ask for something and you get something back that's similar, but not exactly what you ordered or you asked for. And if you question it, they'll just say, oh, same, right? Which pretty much means like, it's the same thing, it's just a little bit different. Get over it, go on. And so in thinking about science teaching through the arts, I like to kind of think of it as that same idea. So it's not doing something, it's not doing one more thing, right? Like I'm not trying to put more stuff on your plate. It's about thinking about doing what you're already doing, but in a slightly different way. So really focusing on subject, how the arts can help you teach your subject, active engagement, the materials you use, and the examples you provide. So we'll dive into that a little bit more. If that is a helpful framework for you, great. If you just like the examples, also great. We all have different ways of thinking about things. So in terms of same, right? So the subject, that S, what's the content or objective I'm trying to address with my students? How can art help? Again, this is really, I just want you to not get lost in the shininess of doing arts education, right? It can be super fun to put on a play or to have kids act out the vocabulary. But if they're not actually also learning the vocabulary or really developing the skills or knowledge that they need to be successful as scientists, then we've kind of lost the plot. So with arts-based integration, you do want to be saying, okay, what am I actually trying to teach? What are my end goals? And how can art help me get there? With regards to active engagement, it's really thinking about how can I get my students moving, thinking, seeing, and hearing in a different way. So this is more about the physical engagement, the mental engagement, and the imaginative engagement. The materials is pretty simple, but it's really thinking what materials can I use that helps them to express or build their knowledge through the arts. And of course, examples. So how can I provide examples? What sorts of examples can I provide that sort of stretch their imagination beyond the textbooks, beyond the worksheets? In terms of the opportunities for integrating the arts, I think you could do this in so many ways, but if it's helpful to have categories, you might think of one-off practices such as the warm-up, where it's just a simple, practice of scientific thinking. It's not really necessarily connected to a content standard. It's more just, hey, this is exciting. Maybe you're celebrating at the end. Maybe you're launching a unit. It could also be daily. You can use it for formative assessment and or a full project or summative assessment. And I'll give you some examples for all of those. All right. Cool. So we are going to do another actual hands-on piece. Now this one, I've labeled it as a one-off in terms of, where it falls in kind of those different opportunities of either a one-off or a daily formative assessment or a project or summative assessment. But I'm sure that you as teachers, as professionals, could find how to make this fit into any of those other categories. So what we're going to do is we're going to watch a short video. It's about 1.5 minutes long. And I would envision, in this example, I'm envisioning using this video as sort of a unit launch or provocation. So at the beginning of a lesson or a unit, perhaps on diversity and pollinators, and that we might watch this video that we're about to watch. And I'm gonna have you do 3 things. And I'll remind you as the video is going. So I'm gonna first just have you make some sketches of what you see in the video. Do not worry about them being perfect. You're not gonna show them to anybody. It's just making some quick sketches or quick notes that will help you remember what you saw. Then I'm gonna ask you to add in a few extra details. And then I'm gonna also ask you to write a few questions, 1 to 3 questions that you have about what you see in this video. All right, and then we'll talk about it. So it's about 1.5 minutes long, just so that you have that time frame. Just as you watch, go ahead and make some quick notes or a quick sketch of what you're seeing. And then add in 2 or 3 details that maybe you didn't notice. Maybe it's something in the background or something in the foreground. We're almost at the end here. See if I can pop back in. Cool. Awesome. So, and then I'd want you to take just a moment here to write down 1, 2, or 3 questions that you might have had about this video. So about what you saw, what you noticed, something else you'd like to learn. And I'll give you, again, we're doing this sort of in fast forward motion, but I'll give you, 30 seconds or a minute or so to just jot down some of your questions about that. All right. So I know we're a small group. I would really be grateful if 1 or 2 of you, who's not your professor, would like to share out either a question that you had from this video or something that you sketched or drew. So something you noticed.
So when I was sketching and watching the video, up front there was a butterfly on the plant itself, but then if you looked more closely about the time that you told us to look more closely, you could see something else in the background on another plant, and I couldn't tell if it was a butterfly or a bee, like you had kind of talked about to intro it. So it raised the question to me, does that flower provide something to the butterfly, or do butterflies also help pollinate such as bees.
Awesome. Those are two great questions, and also thanks for sharing your descriptions. What else did we notice or sketch or questions did we have?
I just wrote my questions, or what kind of butterfly is it and what kind of flower is it?
Perfect. Perfect. So, and again, we're doing the fast version of this, but you can see how just this simple video, which of course you could extend, you could watch on loop, you could have students make further observations or take more time making more careful drawings, refining their drawings, but how just this simple practice can help you start seeing what do your students already know about either biodiversity or pollinators or kind of those mutualistic symbiotic relationships, which is what you're talking about of pollinators and flower species. You're able to start collecting their questions, which might help guide your lesson planning as you move forward. You might see, oh, they all knew that this was a swallowtail, and therefore, you know, I don't even need to name it because the students have done the job. You might see that, oh, they are so curious about how that proboscis works. So yeah, we should definitely spend some time on the anatomy of a butterfly. So again, this simple video, I've very much chosen it to help provide questions and understanding of a particular area in the science content. I've intentionally chosen a slow motion video because, I don't know, a lot of kids really like both slow motion and then the time lapse. I know I thought that that was magic when I was a little kid. So it's something surprising and engaging. It's a way to, even in a virtual world, incorporate field studies, which is pretty unique. You could also be doing this exact same thing, but out in the actual field if you're teaching in person. And then, of course, it's really helping to tie in what they might be learning from a textbook or worksheets to real life, to something that is local, that's place-based, and connected to the world that they know. Great. So I'm going to run through several more examples real quick here, and then we'll have time for some question and answer. So in terms of your daily practice, there's so many different ways that you could incorporate the arts into daily practice. One I really like to do is science notebooks. So when I first started teaching science, I got really interested in Da Vinci's Records of Curiosity, which is what he called the notebooks that he created and spent his life working on, which included his drawings of inventions, his notes on his experiments, as well as sketches of the local environment. And I incorporated this into our daily science notebooks. So be that asking students to really observe closely. And these aren't pictures from my own work, just so you know, these are just examples of some of the sorts of things I did. So helping them to integrate the arts by looking closely and describing colors. Maybe it's actually connecting a science experiment and creating the colors that were created in that science experiment. Lots of field studies opportunities. Actually doing the sorts of observations that you would do in a traditional science class, but incorporating the arts simply through drawing or acting, those sorts of things. But science notebooks, without getting, that could be an entire workshop itself, but can be a really great way to encourage students to not just write and read about science, but to really engage in it in a different way. In terms of a formative assessment, instead of simply saying, make your own drawing of the water cycle, for example, you might provide them with a picture of a local area. So this is the beach nearby my home. And you might actually say to them, okay, I want you to use this picture to label the water cycle, right? So it's a formative assessment, super useful for you, whether you're doing this at the beginning of a project, in the middle of a project, or maybe towards the end. Or, you know, if maybe you have some learners who need a little bit of extra support, you say, hey, using this list of words, go ahead and label the water cycle. So you're really hitting those science standards, but you're doing it while engaging their senses in a different way. They might be looking at a picture that you provide saying, hey, I know that place, I've been there. They're noticing that, oh, the water cycle actually happens in real life, not just in that cheesy picture in my textbook. That they're also really saying, okay, I can come up with other examples because now I know that this is something that happens in the real world. I also want to point out just a few other examples of formative assessments in arts-based teaching. So I play lots of like physical action games, which are a way for kids to express themselves more dramatically. So like acting out the molecular states of water is a really fun one. Writing cell poems, which I can share some examples of. I've got some really adorable ones that I just dug out of my box of cool kid stuff. And then, you know, I talked about earlier reading and listening. So maybe you're reading a passage or out loud, or students are reading it from the textbook, and then you're having them draw what they, or act out even what they read or heard. And again, it's just that quick way of saying, did they get it? What did they miss? I'm not sure. But instead of it always having to be an exit pass or a quiz or something like that. And then in terms of project or summative assessment, this is really big, and I will preface it by saying this takes a lot more time because you really need to focus on clear criteria and, you know, all of your checkpoints along the way. But just so you have a few quick examples, these are actually from some projects I ran with students. So these are 2 masks that we made in a project that we put on the Odyssey. And in science class, we created the backgrounds that were based on actually what you read in the Odyssey and the kind of the flora and fauna of those places. And then in our math class, which I was also the math teacher at that time, we created these masks using measurement, you know, so it was really practicing measurements and ratios. And then students also got to embellish those a bit. And so that was really fun, but it took a ton of work. So I'm kind of giving you that sort of ideal, way far out there piece. I've done soul food projects where you're really looking at food chemistry and digging into the science, but also integrating writing. So this was in partnership with their language arts teacher, which was really fun. And we ended up making a cookbook as a class. It was a really fun way for students to not just as a group do some of the more typical labs, but also to say, oh, I'm also going to share this thing that is a part of me. So getting into a bit of the cultural understanding that comes from food and sharing as a class and as a community. And then integrating, of course, the science, right? So that students could talk about macronutrients and they could talk about endo and exothermic reactions and those sorts of things. And then this is another one, just very simply, that was about looking at animal adaptations, but putting that into story form. So students had to, we spent about 8 weeks looking at animal adaptations in general, in different ways, but then also students became experts on a particular animal, created a book that then they illustrated, and we shared with the local classes. So I don't want to end on these projects with you going, oh my gosh, I'm supposed to create an entire project using arts-based science teaching. No, it's more to say there are so many ways you can do these one-off pieces that are quick and easy. You can be thinking about a daily integration, or you could be really setting your sights on kind of the longer vision, saying to yourself, yeah, someday I think that'd be really fun to do something that integrates a lot more pieces, but still hits on the science I have to teach. Cool. So that was my very quick, trying to keep it quick and concise. So I'm happy to take any questions that you might have about arts-based integration. You know, that's about all I got.
So one idea I'll throw out for you all to keep in mind is that as you're making your lesson plans for your internship part, or even starting into this week, you have an activity you're planning. These are all things that you can borrow and use. So if you're like, oh, I like the describing and drawing activity, I want to, you know, I think it would help with whatever I'm doing, you can stick that in. You don't, it's not, like I said last week, it's not a, oh, well, you heard it in a Zoom session, you can't use it. That's silly. Like pretty much everything I've done, I heard somewhere. So the other thing is, if integrating arts is something that helps you feel excited about working on your lesson plans and figuring out, that has a lot of value. So even if you're like, well, I don't know if I can say this will make kids have a higher test score, who cares? If you're more excited about it, they're going to be more excited about it. One of my all-time favorite science professors was a guy that everyone who ever took his class learned a ton from, and a lot of them kind of hated because he was so passionate about geology, he would like drag them all over the mountains and like sometimes leave people behind. But like you would talk to people 10 years after they had his class and they're like, oh, that guy was a jerk. And then they would like rattle us all the stuff they learned. So if it makes you more excited about it, that's an okay reason. You don't have to be like, well, I'm not sure I can justify it in test scores. So anyway, those are a couple things you can keep in mind, but please ask your questions because you will get a much better answer now than if you email me in like a week about it.
Yeah, and really do. You're welcome to take anything that I shared. Like I said, I'll send you the PowerPoint too, so don't worry about feeling like you need to remember it all. And you can click through some of the links that I've put in there as well. Because one, teachers, we all need to work more on sharing and sharing openly because we are all masters of different parts of what we do. But it also is just an exciting way to try doing science teaching in a different way.
If they're being shy, a question I have that hopefully they all work for wonderful administrators their whole careers. If they accidentally don't at some point, how do you, if you have an administrator that says, why are you taking the time to do this? Just teach them what they need to know. Other than like, I kind of can guess what like your initial reaction is. What would be the like actual answer you would give them?
Yeah, so that's why I mean, as much as, so I'm very comfortable with my science content knowledge because of my own background, right? So I'm incredibly passionate about science. So I can make pretty much any lesson about science off the top of my head. That being said, I think that when you are planning to do this, it can be very helpful to make that preparation to be able to say explicitly, you know, what, especially if you're at a school that really is focusing on meeting specific content standards or working towards a test, a particular test preparation, being able to say, hey, you know, actually this meets, you know, life science standard. You know, I actually had a few written down here. Oh, this one is actually from the kindergarten through second grade, earth sciences, you know, 1-2, and being able to make those clear connections. It's part of why I included that subject piece when you're thinking about your planning. One, because for you as newer teachers, standards are actually quite helpful in wrapping your head around the massive amounts of cool stuff that you get to teach. But at the same time, it's also a nice way for you to be able to say, no, I'm prepared. I've got this. I'm doing this because. Also, just familiarizing yourself around some of the more easily accessible literature of why arts integration is important. And as best as possible, if you choose to integrate it, pay attention. So collect those stories from your kids of how it impacts them so that if somebody does call you out on it, you know, you might say, you know, oh, well, little Emily, she never used to pay attention when it was science time, but ever since we started keeping science notebooks, you know, every single day, she's very carefully making sketches. She's very carefully illustrating the lab reports, et cetera, et cetera. So those three things: being prepared, being able to provide some actual literature or some of the scholarly work to say, hey, administrator, this is what other scholars have said, and then also being able to show it in your students' work of why it's beneficial. That said, I do also believe in just like having fun in the science classroom and saying to yourself, like, if you have that opportunity and you don't have a mean administrator who's going to call you out on everything, is also just sometimes saying, you know, we're going to do something fun and artsy in our science class, and it might not necessarily be tied to a standard. If you have that room, have fun with that occasionally.
Well, and that's one, as you guys get into your own classrooms, unfortunately, you know, hopefully it's not administrators, you will have parents that are like, well, that's not how I was taught. But now, and usually those parents are the ones that like don't understand it at all. And like, cool, I'm not doing it the way you were taught on purpose because you don't understand it. But don't let that like shake your confidence, because a lot of times those parents just, they're uncomfortable because it's not familiar for them. They aren't quite sure how to help their kids. They aren't the experts. And so kind of expect that. And that happens to everyone, and it especially happens to early teachers. Everyone has experienced that. You know, I had parents that, well, why are you doing it this way? That's not how we were taught. It'll happen. So don't take that too personally, especially early on, because it's kind of tough when you're like, are a little bit unsure. My other suggestion, if you're doing something like this and you're worried about that like parent, you know, emailing you of why on earth are they painting whatever, to send positive messages to parents ahead of time about like, hey, I was just so excited. We were doing this, you know, we were using drawing with this activity. And I was just so excited by, you know, how involved your kid was today. It was super cool to see, because no parent gets like a positive email and like responds with like, you jerk, why are you doing it that way? It's always like, oh, thank you so much. And so like I've done that, especially early on. If you're like kind of having a bad day, send a positive email to a parent, because then like you get at least one positive message back. So even if you kind of manufactured it, you're still getting a like, hey, someone said something nice to me today. Like I kind of baited them into it, but one person said something nice to me today. And that might be all you get some days, but it helps. So that's something else to keep in mind. Don't feel like you have to have a big reference list of here's all the evidence that'll make this show why this improves test scores or whatever. You're going to be the professionals and the experts, and you can trust your opinion and your judgment, and you want to base it on something, but that matters. And don't let that kind of shake your confidence. And especially as you're working on your lesson plans this semester, this is a great chance to kind of try stuff out, because if you get stuck at some point, you have all sorts of people you can ask. And you're like, hey, I think I've kind of worked out how to do this, this big arts integrated project. I think it'd be really cool. I keep getting stuck at this spot. You have all sorts of people to ask, so it would be a great chance to kind of test that out.
Yeah, and one thing I just thought of, and I even did this preparing kind of the slides for the presentation today, is it can be, I like thinking about when you're doing lesson planning, I like thinking about the standards when you're trying to integrate those very clear objectives and content standards. Like I said, as opportunities to kind of ground what you want to do in something that makes sense to the larger world. So even in preparing for this presentation, when I send the PowerPoint, I'll actually include you'll be able to see my notes. And so I went in and I linked to the different examples I provided. I linked some of from my own head of, oh, this would fit in with these standards from the NGSS. You might not see the exact connection. Our brains all work differently. But because to me, it was sort of, I went in and I picked out a few that I was really excited about, and then said, okay, how could I share an example that would bring those out? And you can also do it vice versa, right? There was that butterfly video. I really wanted to share that because it's a cool example, especially in virtual learning time. But then I had to go back in and go, what standards would actually be benefited through this sort of work? So you can go both ways, but don't always feel like, I think sometimes standards can get a bad rap, but they can actually be really, really useful in terms of helping you to stay focused, but also really big open-minded.
Are there any last minute questions any of you want to ask? I know Morgan's dog's getting hungry. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Dr. Bretl. She will be back next week to talk about place-based education. One last thing really quick. Some of you already turned in your assignment that's due today. Awesome. I think the directions weren't super clear. If you already turned it in, your life's not ruined. And it's probably already graded, unless it was 30 minutes ago. The goal, you're giving feedback as if your classmate, like their seat dissection, they were a kid in your class and they did the seat dissection. So I saw some were like feedback on the like activity, like as another teacher. That's okay. You have comments in there, but I wanted to try to clarify that because there was enough people that it was obviously not super clear in the directions, not your fault. And if you are already like done the other way, that's fine, turn it in. I'm not being super strict on it because it was obviously not super clear in the directions. And that's something we learned the first time we do a class. So anyway, thank you all so much. I hope you have wonderful frigid days. And we'll see you all next week.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate being here.